In the ESV's translation of 2 Kings 17:1 through 6, we see that in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halah and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Furthermore, in 1 Chronicles 5:23 through 26, we see that the members of the half tribe of Manasseh lived in the land. They were very numerous, from Bashan to Baal Hermon, Sinrir, and Mount Hermon. These were the heads of their fathers' houses: Epher, Ishi, Eliel, Azrael, Jeremiah, Hodaviah, and Jadiel, mighty warriors, famous men, heads of their fathers' houses. But they broke faith with the God of their fathers and whored after the gods of the peoples of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he took them in exile, namely the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh, and brought them the Halah, Habor, Hara, and the river Gozan to this day. Here we have one of the most compelling mysteries of history in the loss of the 10 northern tribes of Israel to the Assyrian Empire and our inability to figure out where they all went after this, which we'll be discussing tonight on Friday Night Frights. I'm your host, Christian Ashley of Systematic Ecology, here to terrify and instruct you on all the weird, unusual, fascinating, fantastical, and unexplainable things that may or may not lurk out there in the world. So, little peek behind the curtain here. I am a little sick right now. That's one of the reasons I postponed, because originally this was supposed to be done last week. Here we are now. It is not that week when I promised it would be done, but that's where we're at. So you may notice me pause to get my voice back, something like that. But I just couldn't justify doing this another week after this. Like, I wanted to get this information out. I want to be having fun doing projects like this. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for your kindness. And we'll get through this together. I'm here to have fun. I hope you're here to have fun. But just as a reminder as well, for Friday Night Frights, for those of you who may be new to this part of systematic ecology, once a month, I, and hopefully a guest at some point in time, Joshua was supposed to be with me last week, but I had to change plans. Here we are. So it's just me again. So that means I'm going to have to take some pauses in between words just to gather myself. That's also why I started a little earlier. Another reason I started earlier is because I need to go to work a little earlier to relieve someone else, because I needed to come in to help them because they needed to go to a conference at their church. So I was more than happy to do that. But that means we're starting a little before 5 instead of 6 like we normally would. So, on the topic of Friday Night Frights, our schedule, once again, for those of you who are new, we cover every month one of 6 categories. We're in our 3rd month. We started with cryptozoology. We did the paranormal. We are now on religious strangeness, which is just a category of kind of a catch-all for anything involving Christianity, anything involving Islam, or what have you, or something like that that seems weird and mystical to the world, or a mystery and history involving those things. That's where we go. Next up will be the weird and the unexplained, and I'll explain what we'll be doing for that at the end of this show, so you know what to read up on before next time. Then after that, we'll be doing true crime. And in December, we'll have finished our first round of all 6 categories with ufology. Then, hopefully, around that time, I will be polling you guys on our Facebook page to see what you would like me to do for each of these months. I'll be starting with cryptozoology, so on and so forth from there. So, thank you again for extending your grace my way. I desperately need it today. But we're going to have fun. We're going to enjoy this topic. It is one of those that's very fascinating in that sense of, where are they? Do we know where they're at right now? This is one of those things to those of us who read our scripture and go, but these are God's people. How could they not be there anymore? How could we only get like the barest glimpse in the New Testament, in the Old Testament as well, of like, what happened to them? Well, my friends, I will do my best to answer that today as I deal with the struggles of speaking. Like I said, we'll get through it. I'm trying not to be a broken record here. Let's move on. So, who are the lost tribes among the 12 tribes? So, in order to establish that, we must first know, well, who are the 12 tribes? We know 10 are lost. There are 12 tribes, and there are going to be some funky numbers coming your way in a second. So, the 12 tribes are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. Now, to the astute listeners out there and viewers, you may have realized that I actually mentioned 13 tribes out of 12. So those numbers don't add up, and there are several reasons for this depending on who's speaking on the tribes. Now, the easiest and the most prevalent would be to address the fact that the tribe of Levi had no land of their own because they were meant to be priests and live in the territory of all tribes of Israel. That's typically what you're going to see as a response to, wait, there are 13 tribes. Well, one of them doesn't really have land. So when they're talking about the assortment of the land, who got what, Levi isn't mentioned because they're supposed to be everywhere. Now, another would be that Simeon was absorbed sometime into Judah after the splitting of the two kingdoms. It's not something we have like a fixed date on, but like they basically just become part of Judah at a certain point in time. And it's not like they lose their tribal identity. It's just they just kind of joined up for a different team. Also, sometimes we see that Ephraim and Manasseh are often called by their father's name Joseph in order to combine the two. So you may see a list sometimes that just says Joseph, but it will include Levi, so you'll have 12 there. It depends on where you're reading. Also, last part is that Dan sometimes is excluded, and this is based on a verse in Revelation where they are not a part of the 144,000 righteous Jews who come to Christ in the midst of the tribulation. Depending on how you interpret that, when we talk about religious strangeness, we're not going to get into Revelation just yet. That's I'm throwing a kind of a softball here before we decide to go anywhere near that, because guess what? No one knows the answers. There's, as much as I've studied that book, as much as I love that book, I don't have all the answers for it. I have ideas. I have really good ones, I think, but I also don't know because it's mixed with symbolism. So there we go. Now, and the reason they're excluded in Revelation, I should add, is because of their apostasy we see in the book of Judges and their continual rebellion against God. When the kingdom split, you see that's Dan was one of the sites, if I remember correctly, where one of the two golden calves was laid by Jeroboam the first. So it's like, hey, God finally just said, I'm done with you. So what some people would argue, and the tribe of Dan is cut off forever. We can't prove that. That's just people speculating. Oh, why aren't they there? It's a good reason, one would think, but we don't know for sure. Now, as my watch goes off, that's lovely. Sorry, it's hard to laugh right now in the midst of this. So, regardless of why, historically speaking, when the tribes of Israel are referred to as a whole, it is always 12. So 12 tribes of Israel, 10 of those, it's really 9.5 sometimes, are then taken off to Assyria. We see when the Assyrians take over Samaria and Israel and the entire land there. Now, those tribes that were taken away by the Assyrians are Reuben, parts of Levi, once again, since they were everywhere, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Now, when it comes to scripture after this point in time, we have very little clues about where the rest of them are. Now, to my astute readers, in the book of Luke, we see the prophetess Anna, who hails from the tribe of Asher. But other than her, we see no overt reference to there being any tribes left in Judea at that point in history besides Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Other than we have some vague titles, like in the book of James, he addresses his book to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, diaspora, but he doesn't it's more like that sense of sometimes some people would argue it's like, oh, well, he's just saying that because that's the way you would do it. Or that's just like his hope that they're out there. So it really depends on who you're asking in that regard. And once again, this is one of those things that there's a lot of debate. And I think there's a clear-cut answer to most of it. But once again, I can't prove all of it. So now you may be asking, okay, what's your main source for some of this? And I'm so glad you asked, because this may be a very controversial pick. And I think it's controversial, so I'd agree with you. What you see in that image right there is Dr. Avigdor Shachan's book called In the Footsteps of the Lost Tribes. Now, word of caution, for the sake of transparency, I will admit that I don't always think he's objective. And in fact, I kind of think he's very guilty of apophenia, which, to those of you who don't know what that term means, it's the desire to link unrelated events together to create meaning. Like, oh, I saw Jesus in my toast today. That means God is out there and he loves me. Well, God is out there and he loves you, but I don't think God's showing up in some toast to tell you that. He could very well do that, but that's not where I'm going to look for it. And I think and it's very complicated, his feelings on this matter. I don't think he's a very brilliant man. A very brilliant man. It's clear this man has done his research. He loves what he's doing. Like, this is a passion project of his. But he's also someone who you find through the book that it's dealing with the trauma of having lived as a young Jewish boy in Europe who just grew up with this mythology of the 10 tribes returning to save the Jews in diaspora. I mean, kind of like an Arthur under the mountain for Britain, or something like that, of, oh, if we just wait long enough, the hero will come and save us. And you have that idea growing up only to be forced into a concentration camp and to suffer through the horrors of the Holocaust. And I would posit that this has caused him to almost deify the idea of the 10 tribes' existence, using whatever slim suppositions and evidence he concocts. Now, I'll also say that I could be the one who's biased in some of this stuff, and some of it may very well be real, as we will discuss tonight, but others I think are more made from just pure wish fulfillment rather than fact. So why then use that book? Well, because, like I said, the man is brilliant. The man has reasons for why he does things. Now, we're not going to get to all of them. Number one, to spare my voice. Number two, to spare my time and your time. But if you guys are interested in picking it up, it is a solid read. I do recommend you do look at it and draw your own conclusions. Once again, this is what I think at the end of the day, and this would be whatever guest host I would think. So let me know what you think. Leave a comment below. If there's anything that you think, oh, well, you didn't cover this as well as I thought you should, or what about these points right here? Like, I'm happy to engage with you. That's fun. Go for it. So now let us go into the potential locations of the lost 10 tribes from across the world. Now, once again, we're going to a huge amount of speculation here for a lot of this. So if there's something out there you're not particularly fond of, once again, just let me know. I am happy to engage with you and see where you're at. So here we see modern day Israel. Now, the simplest explanation, and to show my cards, this is probably one I favor the most to where the lost tribes are, is in the return of the exiles, and they remain within the Jewish population today across the world. Like I said, this is the simplest explanation. And in my opinion, the most probable one, in that after the people of Judah were given the right to return to their home country by Cyrus, well, the people who were already in exile there joined them because they're still Jewish. Now, there are plenty of people out there who will say, well, this isn't explicitly stated. And, well, they're kind of true. They're kind of right to say so. We're not told, like, we had, 75,000 from this tribe or, 8,000 from this one, and they came back. Like, we're not told that information. We're mostly concerned with Judah and Benjamin and Levi. So, and once again, assuming that Simeon has been absorbed by Judah. So that tribe's not really brought up that much. But also remember in Chronicles, they do a very good job. The scribes, whoever wrote Chronicles, we're not entirely sure. It was definitely post-exile, of showing the genealogies of all the tribes. Well, why would they care about the tribes who weren't there unless there were some present? Now, once again, there is an argument, say, well, they were still a part of Israel, so they would want to write that down, and God would still have commanded them to do so. Good argument. I think it's more because, well, there were refugees from Reuben, Gad, so on and so forth, and they would want to know their genealogy as well. So that's where we stand. I think also this would help explain the presence of Anna of the tribe of Asher, and writers like James and Paul speaking of the 12 tribes and the diaspora as if they're functioning as they always had. Now, also as kind of an addendum to this idea, I should also speak, as I gather my voice, that there is a surviving Samaritan population in Israel right now, who came into being, we see in Scripture, due to intermarriage between those of the 10 tribes who remain in Israel following their exile, and the foreign men and women who came to live in the land that was taken from Israel. So there are still blood relatives to those tribes today in Israel, and people often neglect to think about them. And that's why I'm mentioning this now, because the Samaritans are still here, albeit in far smaller numbers. They're not just an illustration used by Jesus for his tales. They're not just a people we see, was it Ezra and Nehemiah, that just hate the Jews, like because they think that their way of doing things is right. It's like, no, there's a lot to them. There's a reason that we see them in Scripture, of God redeeming not only his people, but also the people that they would despise for being, in their mind, half-breeds. And then to go to the Gentiles from there. So I want to give the Samaritans their due diligence. They're still alive. They are survivors of the 10 tribes. So that is still an answer to where some of them are. Now, once again, the premise being the 10 tribes that were taken away, but there are still remnants left behind in the Samaritans, even though I believe, what was the number? It's like 874 or something like that confirmed Samaritans alive today, that, assume that national cultural identity. But sorry, I lost my train of thought there. This is a lot harder to do when you're alone and you have no time to breathe when you're sick. This is just excellent. I'm so glad you all can watch me break down live as you're watching this whole ordeal. You guys are the best. I'm very grateful for you for really everything that you do here. So that's where we stand for that part of the hypothesis. Another simpler one, is that they simply remain in the lands that they were placed in exile. So if I can bring that up, there we go. This would be in the areas of modern day Syria, Iran, and Iraq. And there are plenty of Jewish settlements that are in these very same areas that exist that have continued into modern times. Now, points against this idea. Many people consider these communities to simply be created by Jews in the midst of the diaspora who would have originated from Judea and not from the other tribes. That's a good argument. Now, that's kind of really a constant argument you're going to see against a lot of these points is that, well, it's not the 10 lost tribes. They're members of Judea from the Roman Jewish revolt in 66, 67 AD, all the way to 73 AD. And they simply fled the nation and went elsewhere. And, well, that's true because we can plot some of that and that they left. Now, the question is that only where they came from? Were there still members of the 10 tribes who were in those regions already and then reunited with their brethren when they were fleeing persecution? There's a good point to that. And I think it's something well worth looking into. I just don't favor it as much as they were already part of the nation itself. Now, here we go. Next up. Oof. This is a rough one. It's one I really don't like. But for the sake of talking about it as something, one of the things we want to confront here on the show is bad ideas. And one of those is the idea of British Israelites. Now, once again, it is not impossible for in the midst of the diaspora for Jews to be in England, because guess what? There are. We can prove that. But this idea was formulated by a group of people in a time, well, there's a lot of history, lots of history, it's really this point of view, who were anti-Semitic. There's no easy way of putting it around there. But in their own twisted way, they uplifted the idea of the Jewish people and decided, well, we Britons are now Christians and we are the true successors. But what if we also said we were descended from them as well, and we're the true ones? Those other Jews out there, they're the bad ones, and we're the ones who actually took up the faith and all this. And it is very misleading. It's very irrational. It's very racist. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. But to give them their due credit for why they think the way they do, some of these scholars, and it's not a very popular opinion, I should put it that way, there's an uncommon belief in British scholarship that, and I mean very, very low, not a lot of people believe this. Let me make that perfectly clear. But there's this idea that states that the nomadic tribes that we know as the Scythians, the Sumerians, and the Goths were actually descended from Jewish exiles who would later integrate with the Anglo-Saxons who conquered Britain, thus making British people the true descendants of the Jewish people. Now, they have some stuff to back this up with, this idea. And once again, not getting into everything, but they say that Herodotus, who don't know who that is, a famous Greek historian, like known as the father of history, he's also known as the father of lies, for good reason. Like the man just kind of reported what he heard and didn't really, well, it's really very hard to fact check back in the day. So you have a trader from Egypt say, yeah, there's totally, giant winged serpents that come from Arabia and then into Egypt. It's like, oh man, that's so cool. And he writes it down and then he tells you about it. The man's just reporting back on what he's heard. So I give it Herodotus a little more grace than other people, but you still got to be careful with him. He describes the Scythians as being called by the Persians by the word Sakai, Sacae, or Sakai, or something like that, which British linguists, once again, small minority, would describe as being a change in the name Isaac. Now, why Isaac? Well, their ties to Israel, father of Jacob, who named Israel, would be their idea. So that's that. Now, they further bring in points like how Dan appears in various forms across Europe, whether that be in something like the Danube or Denmark or London. You see the Dan, the vowels kind of change linguistically. So they say, oh, well, that's because of the tribe of Dan, and which is a huge logical leap. And once I'm not a linguist by nature, all you have to do is look at my Greek grades to see that. But this is really flimsy evidence. And it's just, I think it's pure wish fulfillment on their part as well. Now, frankly, this has very little historical value, as genetic studies have shown very little or at all relation between British citizens and them having Jewish ancestry. In fact, this once again it kind of originates from a heretical and racist desire for for Britain to be seen by the world as the true descendants of Israel, and therefore the ones who should guide the world and be seen as the real followers of God. And this is at best a fringe theory in Britain itself. And once again, you will find very few scholars who will give it any credence. But I do want to bring it up because that's how far ideas can be taken. You start with a simple premise: where did the lost tribes of Israel go? And then you start thinking, and the crazy ideas start coming up because it fits what you want. It's like, oh, we're the best because we're actually descended from the Jews and we're the proper ones, is what people would say who believe this. And it's just not true. And the unfortunate thing about some of these things, and when we do get into our next topic for next month, we're going to see some other things prop up there that are also incredibly racist, that come from people taking to things a little too seriously or less seriously than they should. We need to be careful. It is fun to speculate. It is fun to explore. It is fun to ask questions. It is not good to then let other questions, other ideas cloud our view of what we think reality should be simply because it points to my own point of view or my own ideologies. We should be very, very careful. So on a lighter note, we'll move on from there to jolly old Afghanistan. The killer of empires, destroyer of empires. Afghanistan has had historically, as you know, my voice cracks there. That's lovely. A significant Jewish population until today, where I still believe there's just one Jewish man left behind. He may have died. I'd have to look it up. It's kind of hard with the Taliban taking over things again. But over the years, there was a huge, not huge, significant, the word I used earlier, that's probably the better one, Jewish population in the region of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And once again, these simply seem to be Jews who were escaping away from persecution, who probably would have been left over from one of the Persian empires. They're not the Persian Empire we see in scripture, but the Persian Empire, I can't remember the names off the top of my head, that rose up that would oppose Rome and stuff like that. And eventually they were defeated by the Muslims, and they would move into Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now we see in a book called the Makhzani Afghani, which is an historical document that was designed to be, this a genealogical record of the Afghan people, written in about 1620 AD. There are mentions of Jacob, Esau, Moses, Saul, and two Levite women that Saul took as wives, who eventually had descendants named Asaph and Afghana, who came into conflict with King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, lost, and were exiled into what we know as Afghanistan. That is the oral history that was told, that was eventually written down in this book. These people would eventually be known by their preferred title of B'nai Israel or Bene Israel. They also have a presence in India, which we'll discuss in a bit. There's not always a correlation between the two. It's one of those things it's very hard to study. And it's something I forgot to bring up earlier. And something I've definitely said before on the podcast proper. I don't know if I said it here on YouTube. But it's the idea that in history, the further away we get from an event that happened, the harder it is to prove. Unless there are a ton of records saying this happened here, this person was there. At a certain point in time, we do have to use speculation. And as someone who likes things to be concrete, that's not fun to me. And I'm very grateful to all the serious historians out there who pour a lot of work and time into finding these things out so that we can know for certain what events did happen and what events didn't happen. So we see there are many groups, even members of the Taliban today, would say that they share Jewish ancestry, and they don't see that as blasphemous to some extent. And you could argue as well, it might be like the British Israelism there, or it just could be genetically true. There's been very limited genetic testing done that establishes a possible link to the Pashtun people who inhabit these regions, who claim to be descended from Israel, even though today they are majority Muslim. But once again, there's nothing that's been concretely proven as of this recording due to events that have just happened in Afghanistan that are very unfortunate to all the people living there. And as you can guess, uh, being Muslim majority, they don't really like Israel that much. So take that as you will. Now, as for this idea, totally, I find it slightly plausible, but not for the reasons they think. If anything, it continues that idea that there were some Jewish exiles who made their way to this region of the world and over time developed ideas about their past that don't align with scripture because of their just being far away from their fellows, and things ended up getting lost in translation. So I don't think these are the lost 10 tribes. It is probable. I don't think it's true. So next up on our docket, we'll be going to India. And this here is a picture of a Jewish family in India who we see there has been historically uh, not as significant as Afghanistan, but a small Jewish community within India that to this day call themselves the Bene Israel. Their own legends say that they fled to India following the persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes of the Seleucid Empire. This would have been about, was it 168, 167 BC, about 100 years before Rome would eventually take Israel and rule it, is when this is happening. A little over that. So those are their own records, their oral records. There are some that are written down. Others have proposed that they instead descend from the lost tribes who made their way to India and settled after wandering. Once again, plausible. Probable. I don't know if it's plausible. Sorry. Screwing up my words there. It's the medicine. And we see there's a significant number of Jews in India in the first century AD, and we have records of that. And they have a long history of Christianity as an identity as well. Not all the Jewish people in India are Christian, but there was one that was started around the first century. I believe as early as the late 50s AD or maybe the 60s AD. Church tradition and local legends say that the Apostle Thomas, he of Doubting Thomas fame, who, by the way, gets a bad rap, I think we would have been a lot worse dealing with Jesus' resurrection, but that's just me. He made his way to India, seeking after his Jewish brethren, having heard stories of them being there, converted them, and was eventually martyred there. Now, once again, that's a little harder to prove. Not as many records were kept, and if they were, they didn't survive, as we're aware of. So that's something that was passed on over time. Like, he was here, he did this, and we're going to have to take some of that on faith because there's really no primary source that we can wrestle with there. And this is also a huge part of church history as well, is that as ties between the Western Church of Europe and the Middle East and the Eastern Church that was further parts of the Middle East and Asia declined, Christian converts in India would be lost to history for a bit. And as later research arose, they would get lumped together with other scattered Christians across Asia by the title known as Nestorians. Now, this is an erroneous name offered to them that comes from the heretic Nestorius, who believed that Christ's humanity was essentially absorbed by his divinity, and that made him more divine than human, rather than equally human and divine. When I hear We're not here to discuss Christology and the Trinity, but that's why Nestorius is viewed as a heretic. Most Nestorian churches that we call Nestorian denied this over the years, but the name stuck due to the regions they were in at one time being associated with Nestorius. So it's just kind of a catch all name for Christians that were in Asia that we call Nestorians. There's also a very fascinating figure in history here known as David Rubini that honestly, if I did more research into him, we could do our own episode on it uh, for him specifically. And it kind of shares some mythological aspects with another potential episode idea we see in Prester John, who was a supposed Christian king in Asia. It was going to be one of those things like, oh, well, uh, guys, you can totally, send forces here to fight the Mongols, or you can totally fight some Arabs over here, and I'll totally come help you out because I've got my own kingdom here. Is essentially the tale of Prester John, but there's more to it. Now, this strange Jewish man known as David Rubini just appeared in Europe one day to seek audience with the Pope, and he claimed to be from a Jewish community in India. This would have been, I should have written this down, I believe it's the 16th century. And he, like I said, he claimed to be from a Jewish community in India who had ties to Jewish communities in the Middle East and desired for there to be an alliance between his people and the Christians against the Ottomans and the Muslims and Hindus threatening his people in India. But the unfortunate part of this is we don't know if he's legitimate because he eventually fell out of favor in Europe and was put to death by members of the Spanish Inquisition. Bet you weren't expecting that. I'm sorry. So his story is a fascinating one because we know there's Jewish communities in that area, but we don't know just how much of his story was true, how much of it was, maybe I can scam these people out of some money and supplies, or maybe he legitimately was representing his brother who he claimed was a king, and he wanted Christians to help relieve the pressure of them being persecuted in India. We don't know. But it is something very interesting to bring up, something that bears more investigation. But as far as India is concerned, I think the ties there to the lost 10 tribes are very small, if at all. Next up is China. This is another one where we can definitively prove that there are multiple Jewish communities within it. And some of them we know have been there at least since 854 AD. This is primarily in the region, the city known as Kaifeng. If I mispronounce anything this episode, please let me know. Like, that's the last thing I want to do, but some of these words are not natural to me, so I apologize if I do screw them up. Now, in the city of Kaifeng, they alone maintain their records as far as the Jewish communities we're aware of in China as to their genealogical and historical ties to Israel. However, I should probably move the image forward there. That'd be nice. So this would be a Jewish Chinese family here who would we're talking about right now. Unfortunately, however, over the years, their local synagogues fell into disrepair. They were unable to financially support themselves. They were an ethnic minority. Their numbers started dwindling, and they essentially began to take on Chinese names to blend into society better around the end of the 19th century. And even worse, around 1900, in 1900, when the Boxer Rebellion was happening in China, their numbers grew even smaller because of persecution. The Boxers did not like anyone who wasn't Chinese. They saw foreign influence as bad, and they had a point to an extent. Their methods, not the best, though. And once again, as is true to their history, the Jewish people there were persecuted. And their numbers grew smaller and smaller. And by 1977, it appeared as if they were about to die out. At this point in time, some members of the Jewish community there had adopted other religions like Islam. There's a Muslim population there as well. That's a minority. And others left Judaism behind and even became Buddhist priests. So it seems like they're gone. Now, obviously, genetically, they're still around, but as a cultural identity, they have lost that. Now, once again, though, as far as we're concerned with the 10 lost tribes, I find it less plausible because their own records say that they fled from Israel following the Roman Jewish War, where Titus destroyed Jerusalem. So their connections to the lost tribes seem tenuous at best. And I'm bringing this up because that's when people speculated, oh, there are Jewish people here. They've got to be part of the 10 lost tribes. And as time went on, as we learned more about the world and how things came to be, those things need to die off to an extent when presented with better information. Now, could it be possible that there were some members of the 10 lost tribes there? Sure. But with the information we have presented to us, it doesn't seem likely. Now, next up on our docket, and I believe the last country we will be dealing with tonight, we have Japan. Now, here, once again, cards on the table, this is one of the least likeliest, in my opinion. And honestly, I think this is where we see Dr. Shachan at his worst. Once again, in my opinion, there is some evidence that suggests the Jewish people had a presence in Japan going back around the same time as our group in Kaifeng, China. However, Dr. Shachan takes on a very wild suggestion. He doesn't totally say this at times, and if I'm misrepresenting him, if I've misremembered something and you read the book and say, Christian, you're wrong, correct me. I'm open to correction. He takes on a very wild suggestion that the Jews actually either became the Japanese people or integrated so much into their society that parts of their Jewish beliefs intermingled with Shintoism. Now, this is a wild hypothesis, and one that's not really corroborated by genetic evidence either. But there haven't been widespread DNA searches to see a link between Jewish people and the Japanese people that I am aware of in my research. Once again, I think this is where he's at his most fanciful. It's very fascinating stuff, and we can't get into everything he says because I am pressed for time. But the idea is astounding, and it's very similar in some respects to the British Israelism we saw earlier. I don't think it's a one-to-one, but I do see the ties between the two. So some things he brings up, there are a lot of, he posits linguistic links between Hebrew and Japanese that seem similar enough to be possible. And he doesn't just use Hebrew, he uses Aramaic and he uses Arabic. We're not going to cover everything. Here's two examples I have. Now, in Japanese mythology, the island of Japan is created in some stories, I believe the main story as well, by the god Izanagi dipping his spear into water, causing the island to jut up from the sea. The island is named Onogoro, which Shachan claims is taken from the Hebrew Anu Nagoro, which means we will dwell here. Now, like I said, I'm not a linguistics person, but studying languages, you do see things like this. To give him credit, of words one culture would use, another culture hears it, and it becomes something else. Like English has plenty of things like this, of words we've absorbed from other countries because English is an illegitimate child and just takes things from other languages and makes things its own. This is a probable enough idea. I don't think there's enough evidence that it suggests it. He also uses our second example here. Once again, I just pick these out of the examples he gives. There are others you can read for yourself. The Japanese tradition of keeping and preserving historical events by using longer titles to describe them, is referred to there as Makura Kotoba, which Shachan says it relates to Makara Kitavo in Hebrew, which means that which occurred, he wrote down. Once again, probable. I don't think it's highly likely. So, like I said, we're not going to get to all of them. There are plenty more. And one other thing he does bring up, different from linguistics, is similarities in his mind between Shinto religious rituals and some Buddhist rituals in Japan and um, Jewish customs and rituals, such as prayer and having tabernacle like objects, he says in some way relates to Jewish priestly customs. But really, I mean, when you look at comparative religions across the world, it just kind of looks like that's a commonality that's found pretty much worldwide in some respects, rather than just being a clear connection. And once again, this is me thinking of him in that sense of I think he just likes to connect things. And connecting things can be fun, but we have to do it within reason. So, with that, our final judgments. There are plausible reasons to think the Jewish people of the 10 tribes still exist to this day. I don't think you'll find many people out there who say they're not. And once again, I didn't go over every single option due to time, but there are plenty of other ideas and why is a very wide range of ideas, continuing our heretical and racist ideas, is the idea that the Jews fled to the Americas and became the First Nation tribes that we know today. And I'll let you speculate what I mean by that for those of you in the know of why I think that's racist. And then we have other ideas with better merit, such as the Limba people of Southern Africa, uh, who observe. I cannot speak tonight. Goodness gracious. They observe Jewish customs and claim descent from them. Regardless, we find ourselves with little true answers here for some of that. So, where do I stand on this? By far, like I said earlier, I think the most plausible one is that the northern exiles returned with their southern brethren when Cyrus allowed them to remain in Judea. They intermarried and eventually, essentially, just became parts of the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Although a small remnant maintained their formal tribal identities at least until the birth of Jesus, like I said with Anna. It explicitly states she's from the tribe of Asher. So that tells me there's enough of a remnant left that sees himself from that point of view. It is likewise plausible that there were some who simply remained where they had been exiled and simply lost their cultural identity along the way and merged with the people around them. As far as the other nations where Jewish people have been found over the years is concerned, I believe them to be refugees from the Jewish revolt against Rome, who are of the southern tribes and maintain their religion as best as possible, just like the Jews of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. I mean, there's plenty of surviving Jewish populations all across Europe. And some I still believe today in North Africa. There were plenty back in the day. And the same thing in their pockets in the Middle East. But what does this all mean? Ultimately, what matters in all of this is that God is still sovereign over his people, whether they be Jews or Gentiles. In Revelation, in Revelation 7, we do see God's people choosing him in the end. So there is still a remnant out there, and they will bring glory and honor to his name, just like those of us who are called to be his should do the same. And with that, dear listeners and viewers, what do you think? What do you believe? Where are the lost tribes of Israel located? Are they lost at all? What purpose can we find in their disappearance from history in their native land? We didn't touch everything that history and folklore have on the subject tonight. So let us know in the comments below if there's something you'd like us to do a follow-up on. In the description below, you can find the sources used for tonight's program. And I thank you all again for your patience, kindness, and grace, for dealing with my voice, for dealing with me being sick. I do want to apologize as well for last month with the vampires. My audio was so bad. I think I finally figured things out. It was just so soft and I hated it. So I do apologize for that. I want to give you guys the best I can, even in the midst of this sickness. So thank you for all you do. Thank you for continuing to watch these. I really enjoy doing it. So next time, on October 13th, he said, hoping that he actually does that day, like he promises. That's why you don't have me as God, because he actually keeps his promises. On October 13th, we will be moving on to our next category, the weird and the unexplained, where we will be discussing Atlantis and whether or not the continent ever existed. So thank you all again for tuning in. Remember, above all else, we are all a chosen people, a geekdom